Something unprecedented just shattered 248 years of American constitutional governance. Military forces are mobilizing right now under direct congressional authorization to physically extract a sitting president from the White House. Donald Trump, mere minutes ago, stood before cameras and flatly rejected an impeachment conviction delivered by the United States Senate. Let me be absolutely crystal clear about what you're witnessing. This is not political theater or symbolic posturing designed for cable news ratings. This is the constitutional machinery of American democracy grinding against itself in ways that no living person has ever witnessed in their lifetime. Here's what makes this genuinely terrifying, and I want you to really absorb this for a moment. Have you ever wondered what would actually happen if a president simply said no to the Constitution itself? Not in some hypothetical classroom debate or law school examination, but in real life with real soldiers receiving real orders and real consequences hanging in the balance. That exact nightmare scenario is unfolding right now in Washington, D.C. as we speak. The Senate voted to convict Donald Trump just under an hour ago in a historic proceeding that will be studied for centuries. The tally was absolutely devastating. 71 senators voted guilty, 29 voted to acquit. 20 Republican senators crossed party lines, joining every single Democrat to remove a president from their own party. The charges were not trivial or ambiguous in any way. Trump was convicted of betraying national security for personal financial enrichment, the most serious allegation possible against a commander-in-chief. But here's what absolutely nobody anticipated would happen next. Within 12 minutes of that vote being officially certified, Trump walked into the White House briefing room, surrounded not by Secret Service agents, but by private security contractors, and declared to the entire world that he categorically refuses to leave office. But the real story starts when you understand what Congress did in direct response. Congressional leadership from both chambers and both parties issued a formal request for military and federal law enforcement personnel to execute a constitutional removal order against a sitting president. That has never happened in American history. Not during Watergate when Nixon faced certain conviction. Not during the Civil War when the nation literally tore itself apart. Not ever in 248 years. Hit that subscribe button right now because this story evolves minute by minute and you cannot afford to miss what happens next. According to official Senate records released 34 minutes ago, the final conviction vote concluded at precisely 3:17 p.m. Eastern Time this afternoon. 71 senators found Trump guilty of systematically trading classified military intelligence to foreign governments in exchange for billions of dollars funneled through Trump Organization accounts around the world. The evidence presented across 3 grueling weeks of testimony left senators from both political parties visibly shaken and disturbed by what they witnessed. Prosecutors introduced intercepted communications, actual transcribed conversations captured by American intelligence, showing Trump personally discussing classified satellite reconnaissance capabilities with unauthorized foreign officials. Treasury Department investigators presented meticulous financial records tracing approximately $2.3 billion flowing to Trump entities following those intelligence disclosures. 4 separate national security whistleblowers took the stand under oath and independently corroborated the damning pattern of disclosure followed by payment. This was emphatically not a partisan split along predictable political lines. Senate Majority Whip John Thune voted to convict. Judiciary Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham voted to convict. Intelligence Committee Vice Chairman Marco Rubio voted to convict. These are not fringe Republicans or longtime Trump critics. They represent pillars of the conservative establishment who examined the classified evidence and concluded that continuing to defend Trump meant destroying their own integrity and betraying their constitutional oaths. 12 minutes after the vote was formally certified, Trump materialized in the briefing room flanked by approximately a dozen individuals wearing dark suits with visible earpieces, individuals quickly identified by White House correspondents as employees of private security contractors rather than federal agents. He gripped the podium with both hands, his knuckles visibly white with tension, and delivered an 8-minute statement without accepting a single question from assembled journalists. According to the official White House transcript released 29 minutes ago, his exact words included, I do not recognize this fraudulent Senate vote. I was elected by the American people, not by corrupt senators engaged in a coordinated coup against your government. I remain your president, and I will continue executing my duties. Any attempt to remove me from this building will be met with full and complete resistance. Constitutional scholars watching this unfold on live television immediately recognized what they were witnessing: the nightmare scenario that every serious student of democratic governance has feared, but assumed institutional norms would prevent from ever actually occurring. Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard Law School, speaking to CNN just 18 minutes ago, stated in terms that should alarm every American: the Constitution assumes compliance with its processes. The founders never conceived of a situation in which a president convicted by the Senate would simply refuse to vacate the office he no longer legally holds. We have entered genuinely uncharted constitutional territory, and the only available remedy now is physical enforcement of the removal mandate the Senate has issued. That enforcement mechanism activated precisely 23 minutes ago in a manner that will be studied by historians for generations. House Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, two men who agree on virtually nothing politically, released an extraordinary joint statement. Following the president's public refusal to accept the lawful verdict of the United States Senate and pursuant to our constitutional duties, we are formally requesting the House and Senate Sergeants at Arms coordinate with appropriate military personnel to execute the removal order. This action is undertaken with full gravity. No individual, regardless of office, stands above the constitutional order. The statement explicitly confirmed that the Joint Chiefs of Staff have been officially informed of the Senate conviction and resulting presidential succession, and that military chain of command now recognizes J.D. Vance as the lawful commander-in-chief, effective immediately upon the Senate vote reaching the constitutional threshold. Smash that like button if you're following the gravity of what's unfolding here. Here's the absolute kicker that should terrify anyone who cares about constitutional governance. The most devastating element of this crisis isn't simply Trump's public defiance of the Senate verdict. It's the calculated, systematic preparation that preceded that defiance. Preparation that reveals this was not an impulsive reaction, but a premeditated strategy designed over weeks in anticipation of exactly this outcome. According to multiple sources with direct knowledge of White House activities over the past 72 hours, Trump held a series of private meetings with executives from private security contracting firms. He engaged in detailed discussions about physically relocating federal agency headquarters to locations outside Washington, and he personally supervised drafting executive orders that purport to dissolve the Senate's constitutional impeachment authority entirely. One draft executive order obtained by Politico and published 41 minutes ago claims to invoke emergency powers to suspend enforcement of any legislative actions the president deems threats to executive authority. Constitutional experts immediately identified the document as completely legally meaningless, a piece of paper carrying no more force than a personal diary entry. But what that document reveals about Trump's strategic thinking is profoundly alarming. He's not merely refusing to leave, he's actively attempting to construct parallel authority structures that bypass the constitutional order entirely. The Washington Post reports that Trump's team negotiated contracts with 3 separate private security firms, collectively employing more than 200 former military special operations personnel and former federal law enforcement officers. Financial records show Trump Organization entities transferred approximately $47 million to these contractors between January 15th and February 3rd. The contracts include provisions for protecting Trump at multiple geographic locations, securing communications infrastructure independent of government systems, and what one document describes as facility defense operations, a term security experts interpret as preparation for physically defending locations against attempted entry. This crisis places military and law enforcement in an absolutely impossible position. On one side, they face direct congressional orders to execute constitutional removal following legitimate Senate conviction with overwhelming bipartisan support. The oath military personnel swear requires supporting and defending the Constitution, which clearly provides for impeachment and removal. On the other side, they face a president who technically remains in physical possession of the White House until removed, who commands significant personal loyalty from some personnel, and who actively issues conflicting orders claiming continued authority. General Mark Milley, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, stated on MSNBC 15 minutes ago, "This is the scenario we train for but pray never happens. The military's fundamental obligation is to the Constitution, not to any individual. A lawful Senate conviction supersedes any claim to continued authority. But executing that mandate requires personnel on the ground to make judgment calls in real time about which orders are lawful. That's extraordinarily difficult." If Trump claims he never shared classified information for profit, he contradicts the intercepted communications that 71 senators reviewed and found compelling enough to convict. If he admits sharing information but claims legitimate policy purposes, he faces financial records showing $2.3 billion in payments that investigators characterized as quid pro quo. If he claims presidential authority to conduct foreign policy, he still confronts bipartisan conviction, determining his conduct betrayed his oath. No coherent defense addresses all three simultaneously, which is precisely why defiance became his only remaining option. Former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, the retired four-star Marine general, told NBC News 19 minutes ago, "What we're witnessing is a president who believes personal will supersedes constitutional order. I served in this administration. I resigned because I saw this tendency developing, but I never imagined it would reach the point where a convicted president simply declares he won't leave. This is how democracies die, not through military coups, but through elected leaders refusing to accept constraints of the system that empowered them." Drop a comment with your thoughts on where this crisis leads. I genuinely read every single one. Every federal agency must now make immediate determinations about which orders to recognize as legitimate. Does the Department of Justice recognize Trump's continued authority or Congress's removal order? Does the Secret Service protect a president constitutionally removed but physically refusing to depart? Do military commanders implement orders from Trump or recognize Vance as legitimate commander-in-chief? Reports from inside federal agencies paint absolute chaos. According to a Department of Homeland Security official who spoke to Reuters 14 minutes ago, Secret Service leadership held emergency conference calls where legal counsel advised protective details should remain in place until removal occurs, but should not interfere with lawful removal processes. The FBI instructed field offices to await directors' guidance before acting on White House orders, essentially creating a pause on presidential directives until the crisis resolves. National security implications extend far beyond American borders. Foreign adversaries watch the United States government fracture in real time on live television. Intelligence agencies must decide whether to continue sharing classified information with an administration in constitutional crisis. Military commanders in active theaters must determine whose orders carry legitimate authority. Admiral James Stavridis stated to CNBC 8 minutes ago, "Our adversaries are reading this as systemic weakness. When a country cannot execute its own constitutional processes, when competing factions claim authority simultaneously, that's when miscalculations happen internationally. That's when adversaries probe defenses. The national security risk is immediate and severe." Long-term constitutional implications will fundamentally alter how the republic functions for generations. If Trump successfully defies removal despite legitimate conviction, it establishes that impeachment is effectively meaningless as a constitutional remedy. Future presidents will understand they can engage in virtually any conduct and face no practical consequences as long as they're willing to refuse removal orders. That's not a constitutional republic. That's the precursor to every authoritarian system in history where personal loyalty replaces institutional legitimacy. Financial markets reacted with immediate severity. The Dow Jones dropped 847 points in the final trading hour, the sharpest single-hour decline since the pandemic's early weeks. Treasury bond yields spiked as investors fled to safety assets. The dollar declined against every major currency. Economists warn uncertainty alone could trigger recessionary conditions if the crisis extends even a few days. Here's what makes Trump's strategy extraordinarily dangerous, and paradoxically, why it likely accelerates rather than prevents his removal. By publicly defying conviction and characterizing it as a coup, Trump forces every federal official and service member to explicitly choose sides. There's no middle ground available anymore. You either recognize the Senate's constitutional authority or Trump's claim to continued power. The positions are mutually exclusive. For the overwhelming majority of federal personnel, career officials who swore oaths to the Constitution rather than any individual, that's not actually a difficult choice when forced to make it explicitly. Military law experts point out that service members swear to support and defend the Constitution, not the president. When those conflict, the oath requires siding with constitutional process. Retired Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson stated on PBS 4 minutes ago, "The military isn't going to stage a coup to remove Trump, but they're also not going to defend him against lawful execution of a Senate conviction. The president will discover that defiance only works if people follow your orders. And when those orders contradict the Constitution, most won't follow them." According to the latest Capitol Hill reports, congressional leaders established a deadline of 8:00 p.m. Eastern Time tonight for Trump to voluntarily comply before enforcement action begins. That's less than 3 hours away. This isn't political theater ending in negotiated compromise. This is the constitutional system being tested in ways the founders hoped would never happen. Vice President Vance waits at an undisclosed, secure location with congressional leaders and military officials, determining immediate steps for securing constitutional succession. The White House complex has entered complete lockdown with access restricted. Americans watch live as cable networks provide continuous coverage of a crisis without precedent or clear resolution path. For the first time in 248 years, a president was convicted by the Senate with overwhelming bipartisan support, including 20 members of his own party. For the first time in American history, that convicted president categorically refuses to accept removal. Congress has formally requested military assistance to enforce the constitutional mandate. The Joint Chiefs have acknowledged succession. And in less than 3 hours, the world discovers whether the system designed to prevent tyranny can actually function when someone with executive power simply says no. This isn't merely another political controversy that dominates headlines for a week before fading. This is the moment that will define whether constitutional democracy can survive the emergence of leaders who reject institutional constraints entirely and possess enough resources to make that rejection temporarily viable. What happens tonight determines whether we still possess a constitutional republic governed by law, or whether we've entered a new era where personal power backed by loyal personnel supersedes written constitutional provisions entirely. The Senate has voted, the Constitution provides the remedy, and now we discover whether that remedy can actually be executed when its subject refuses to comply. The stakes have never been higher for American democracy as an operating system. The constitutional crisis has never been more immediate or more profound. Everything we understood about how this country functions is being tested right now in real time.